Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about hormones and endocrine glands and how they work, and also talking about the very first gland, the pituitary gland, which is also known as the master gland, and which hormones it releases. So the endocrine system is basically the whole topic for this entire chapter, and it is basically a bunch of glands that release a bunch of different hormones into our body. Okay, these hormones are going to go into the bloodstream and they're going to be transported around our body into different tissues that they turn on some sort of process. So the hormone word actually means to excite or set in motion. So hormones are basically going into these certain cells and setting into motion some sort of regulatory response. So something like changing the blood glucose levels or changing the calcium levels or telling cellular respiration to occur faster or slower. So something like that, the hormones are going to be in charge of. So hormones have our two different areas. So it's, remember, coming from an endocrine gland, and it would be going somewhere in our body to some sort of target tissue. Okay, so that tissue will have certain receptors on the outside of the cell or inside of the cell that is targeted by that specific hormone. So the endocrine gland will release that hormone. That hormone will travel through our bloodstream and eventually reach the target tissue. And notice that the target tissue has these receptors that match with the certain hormone. So if the hormone had a circular type of end to it, it wouldn't necessarily match with the receptors, and it would match with other target tissues in the body. So if the target tissue was maybe the bones, for example, okay, all of the bone cells would have these type of receptors on them, and that specific hormone, maybe it's human growth hormone, is going to connect to that bone cell to cause it to start doing protein synthesis or cell division or something like that. So remember that hormones are carried through the blood, but they only go to certain cells, which would be the target tissue that it's going to specifically turn on that certain function. And it uses these receptor sites to match with the hormone. So it's kind of like a lock and key. If they don't match with that certain receptor, that means that that hormone is not going to fit, which means that no reaction is going to happen. And every single cell has a certain receptor site that matches with certain hormones. So we have a bunch of different types of hormones, but we're going to classify them into two different categories. So every hormone has a unique characteristic about it and a unique function. So it has a unique structure and composition of it, and actually what it does is unique to each hormone. And we're going to classify them into two different categories. Either they're a protein-based hormone or a lipid-based hormone, which we could also call steroid hormones. So now that we know that, we're going to fill in this table. So steroid hormones are slow-acting, are made up of lipids, which are fats. Protein hormones are made up of amino acids, which is the smallest piece of a protein. Steroid hormones that are made up of lipids are lipid soluble, which means they dissolve in fat and they'll hang out in your fat tissue. Whereas protein hormones are only water soluble. So they can dissolve in water, but they can't actually dissolve through fat, which means that when they're binding to the site, the receptors, they have to bind to the outside of the cell if they're water soluble, because they won't be able to go through the phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid bilayer is the cell membrane, which means that steroid hormones have the ability to dissolve through the cell membrane and go into the actual cell, whereas the water soluble don't have the ability to dissolve through that cell membrane, so they have to bind to the outside. So steroid hormones come from two different places in our body, either the adrenal glands or the gonads, which are the testes and ovaries, depending on the person. Whereas protein hormones basically come from every other type of gland, so like the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the pancreas, or any other gland that we're talking about for the endocrine system other than the adrenal gland and the gonads. So steroid hormones are sex hormones or stress hormones. Okay, steroid starts with an S, sex starts with an S, and so does stress. So our sex hormones would be like testosterone and estrogen. Our stress hormones would be like cortisol and aldosterone and epinephrine. Okay, those are examples of steroid hormones. Protein hormones are basically everything else. So like human growth hormone or insulin or thyroxine. Okay, these are words that you might not know yet, but we will learn throughout this chapter. We also have two different other classifications for hormones, whether they're tropic or non-tropic. A tropic hormone is like a messenger hormone that's going to another endocrine gland that's telling it what to do. So that endocrine gland needs that hormone to stimulate it so that it can release its main hormone, which is what a non-tropic hormone is. So tropic hormones are like the messenger ones. Non-tropic hormones are just like the actual ones that are doing its specific function, going somewhere in our body and telling a cell to basically turn on or do a certain function. Okay. So a tropic hormone, the examples that come from our anterior pituitary in particular, we have something called ACTH and TSH. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone because it's a tropic hormone. It's going to go to the adrenal cortex and tell the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Okay. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone because it goes to the thyroid and tells the thyroid to release its hormone, thyroxine. So again, these are hormones that go to another endocrine gland and tell that endocrine gland to release a hormone. Whereas non-tropic hormones go somewhere else in the body. So for example, HGH, which is human growth hormone, is going to go to the bones and tell the bones to grow. Okay, oxytocin is going into the tissues of the uterus and starts contractions for the uterus when the woman goes into labor. So those are two examples of non-tropic hormones because they have a specific function. They're not telling another gland to release another hormone. Now, all of our hormones are controlled by something called feedback loops. And usually the example that we talk about in particular are negative feedback loops. So negative feedback loops are basically step-by-step kind of flow charts of what's happening, where eventually we're going to make something turn on, making levels go back to normal, and eventually turning itself off because we don't want to go over the normal. So our normal in our body is in homeostasis. Homeostasis is where we always want to be at. Okay, so homeostasis for certain things will be kind of a range of values, whether it's pH or temperature, amount of blood sugar. Okay, we have kind of a range of what's normal. If there's an imbalance, whether that's too much or too little, that's not homeostasis. So we want to make sure that these hormones are being released, maintaining this homeostasis, not going over this way or over this way, just staying in the middle. Okay, so you'll notice that this picture is very similar to a reflex arc, where there's a receptor in our body where it's looking at certain levels of something, and then there's a control center. Okay, and then that control center will tell an effector to release a hormone. That hormone will then bring our body back to homeostasis. So if we're looking at an example of a receptor, okay, that receptor might be the thing in our body that's controlling our pH or watching for our pH. Okay, these are found in our arteries, and they're just looking at the level of pH in our blood so that our pH stays relatively constant in our blood. Really large changes in our blood pH can actually cause our proteins to denature and can be fatal. So that receptor is going to be monitoring our pH in our blood. If the pH changes, it's going to tell the control center in our brain that something is happening in our pH of our blood that we need to fix. And that control center in our brain is going to tell some gland or something in our body to do something different so that our pH can go back to normal. Okay, so the effector could be a specific gland releasing a hormone that's going to change how fast we're breathing or how slow we're breathing or our blood pressure or something like that, which then goes and changes our blood pH back to the homeostatic level. Now, if we continue to release that hormone that was changing our pH back to normal and it ended up changing our pH to another imbalance that was on the other end of normal, that also wouldn't be helpful. We just want to make sure that it's just maintaining homeostasis. So once it gets back to a normal level, we'll stop releasing this hormone, which is a negative feedback loop. Okay, we don't want to go over the other side of normal, making our body still not at homeostasis. That's not the point of this. We just want to maintain that normal level. So I'm going to be drawing a picture of a similar idea to this, another example in class with you guys. But this is a general idea of how this kind of works. So we have a bunch of different glands in our body that control all of these hormones. You have to know each name of them and where they're located. So for A is the hypothalamus, which is a part of our brain, which also kind of controls our pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has two kind of sections to it. So the posterior pituitary gland will be closer to the back of the head, and the anterior pituitary gland will be closer to the nose. Okay, so it's kind of sitting like this in orientation, and there's kind of two lobes to it, one that's closer to the back and one that's closer to the front. They each release different types of hormones, so you have to know the difference between the two. Moving down to the part of our throat that's just right below our voice box or our larynx. It looks like a kind of a butterfly-shaped gland. It's called the thyroid. And then below that E in our diagram, we don't actually have to know. It's called the thymus, but you don't have to know it for Bio30. F in our diagram is pointing to the outside portion of our adrenal gland, and G is pointing to the inside. For Bio30, you don't have to know the words cortex and medulla. You can just call it the adrenal gland. It just in this picture separates them into two separate pieces. We don't have to know the difference between the two of them in Bio30. H is pointing to the pancreas. And then in most humans, we don't have both of these, I and J, but we just, for the sake of saving space, we put them both in one diagram. So I is pointing to the ovaries because they're connected to the fallopian tubes in the uterus of this picture. And then there's also, this individual also has testes. Okay, again, normally in most humans, you would have just one or the other. And then some of the hormones have abbreviations, which you guys would have seen in that table that I was filling in earlier in this video. These abbreviations are not something that you have to have memorized, so you will always be given this list of abbreviations, and I will also be giving you a data sheet with these on them. Okay, you'll be given this data sheet on tests and quizzes that you can use, and you can always look up these abbreviations and what they mean, so you don't have to worry about memorizing them. So we're going to move now into talking about the pituitary gland, which is, remember, the master gland in our body that releases a bunch of hormones, more hormones than any other gland, I would say, in our endocrine system. It has the anterior and posterior lobes, and it controls a lot of other places in our body. So not only does it release a lot of different hormones, it also releases a lot of tropic hormones that control other glands in our body. So the hypothalamus is also in our brain that kind of works with the pituitary gland, and it will tell the pituitary gland what to do. When it's controlling the posterior pituitary gland, which is closer to the back side of our head, it uses nerve impulses to signal the posterior side. And if it's telling the anterior side what to do, instead of sending nerve impulses, it uses actual like hormone releasing factors, which are like hormones but just slightly different. So they're like a hormone where they would go down through the bloodstream into the pituitary gland, tell the pituitary gland, the anterior side of it, to release a certain hormone. So the releasing factor is kind of a similar idea to a hormone, but just slightly different. Now, the pituitary gland releases all of these different hormones. So the posterior side of it is just releasing these ones. So first of all, ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone, it's going to travel through the bloodstream and go down into our kidneys and cause our kidneys to reabsorb water so that we're not peeing it all out. We also have oxytocin, which has two functions. So you guys could connect these boxes together and just write it oxytocin once. So it either goes into the uterus and tells the uterus to start contracting, which causes those contractions that push the baby down into the cervix, causing the cervix to widen or dilate to 10 centimeters and all that fun stuff during labor. We'll talk more about oxytocin in chapter 14 and 15. But you should recognize that it comes from the posterior pituitary gland right now. It also goes into the mammary glands and helps with milk release when women are breastfeeding. Now, the anterior portion of our pituitary gland releases a lot of those tropic hormones, which target other endocrine glands. So like thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid, hence the name. We also have ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which goes into the adrenal gland or the adrenal cortex and tells it to release cortisol, which is another hormone that we'll talk about later. Prolactin is one that also helps with the milk production, just like oxytocin. Those things will work together in order for a woman to properly breastfeed. Again, we'll talk more about that in chapter 14 and 15. And then human growth hormone. This one is not a tropic hormone. It is an actual one that has a real function. And this will tell the bones and tissues and other cells in our body to do cell division and protein synthesis and break down fat, which we'll talk about in its own separate video. And then we have two hormones in this box, FSH and LH, which go into the ovaries and testes and basically cause the ovaries and testes to make like ova, which are eggs, and sperm, or make other hormones like testosterone or estrogen and progesterone. So again, we'll talk way more about these hormones, FSH and LH, in chapter 14 and 15 when we're talking about the reproductive system. So that's pretty much all you have to know about the pituitary gland. Hopefully it makes sense. If not, please let me know and I'll answer some questions for you. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.